Haven't actually checked the barge in a while, see if we've got any profits. Oh, it's happened! It's happened! We've finally sold some dirt! Well, you can see I've got some doors here. Now, I don't know what I'm gonna do with all these doors. Boop, she-doop, a door, shoot-be-doop, a doop, she-doop, a door, shoot-be-doop, a doop, she-doop, a door, shoot-be-doop, a doop, she-doop, de-boop, she-doop, a-boop, she-doop-be-dory-doop. More doors for me, a door-y-dee. Lots of doors for me, a door for me, another door for me. It'll do for me, a couple of door-y-dees. Pesky bird, pesky, pesky, pesky bird, pesky bird, pesky, pesky bird. Boop, she-doop, a dory shoop-be-doop, a doop, she-doop, a dory shoop-be-doop, a doop, she-doop, a dory shoop-be-doop, a doop, she-doop, de-boop, she-doop, a boop, she-doop-be-dory-doop. More doors for me, label these. Lots of doors for me, a door for me, another door for me. It'll do for me, a couple of door-y-dees. Doop, she-doop, a dory shoop-be-doop, a doop, she-doop, a dory shoop-be-doop, a doop, she-doop, a dory shoop-be-doop, a doop, she-doop, de-boop, she-doop, a boop, she-doop, de-doop-doop-doop-doop-doop, 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 de-doop-doop-doop-doop, she-doop. Pesky bird. Oh no.
So now I have to place about 1 billion slabs. That is the plan at this point in time, is just to place thousands upon thousands of slabs. It's not really that exciting. Placing slabs, they're the same as full blocks. Placing slabs, but shorter. Placing slabs, slabs. Right clicking with the bucket. Placing slabs, they're the same as full blocks, but shorter. Placing slabs, right clicking with the bucket, they'll hold water. Placing slabs, they're the same as full blocks, but shorter. Placing slabs, right clicking with the bucket, they'll hold water. Yes! Slabs, they're the same as full blocks, but shorter. Slabs, right clicking with the bucket, they'll hold water. Placing slabs, they're the same as full blocks, but shorter. Placing slabs, right clicking with the bucket, they'll hold water. Placing slabs, they're the same as full blocks, but shorter. Placing slabs, right clicking with the bucket, they'll hold water. Yes! So one song, and many thousands of slabs later, we have got ourselves one full platform. Now obviously this is just one piece of the puzzle. We've got a lot of dirt to place, we've got a lot of rails to place, who knows? We might have a full album by the end of this video. For the different blocks. I'm doing anything to keep myself entertained here. That's a lot of slabs. Let's get back to business. What am I doing? What am I doing? Tiny time lapse, 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 time lapse, that's it. Time lapse, beautiful. Time lapse, cool. Time lapse, time lapse, time lapse. This is gonna take a while. Time lapse. So now I have to do the incredibly dull task of working out where the items are going to go, you know? So, you know what that means? It's a tiny, 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 tiny time lapse. 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 Time lapse, time lapse, time lapse, time lapse. Tiny, tiny time lapse. Yes. Tiny, tiny time lapse. Tiny, tiny time lapse. Tiny, tiny, tiny. Really good. Tiny, tiny time lapse. Right. Tiny, tiny time lapse. Tiny, tiny time lapse. Wait, hang on, what? There's got to be a creative way in which we can work around this. It definitely isn't the fastest method in the world, but let's crack on with the third person time lapse. Tiny, 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 tiny 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 time lapse. Time lapse, time lapse, time lapse, time lapse. That's not good. Oh, that is not good. This is ridiculous. I don't even know what to say. I'm also a tiny, tiny, tiny bit embarrassed. I've done enough talking. That definitely sounded like something from a horror film. Let's move on.
Here we go. Time to sleep. Sun going down. Here we go.
Oh dear.
Oh dear.
No, you're supposed to reply Omega.
Oh,
Don't you remember? This is our code of. This
I
is
forgot.
our code.
I forgot how we start the bit. Okay, go again. Go again.
Okay. Oh dear.
Omega.
See, now it didn't have the same
No, you
feeling.
meant to keep going because it gets better as it goes along. All right.
Oh dear.
Omega.
Oh dear. Top that.
Go on.
Oh dear.
No. Okay. I think we're gonna
my throat.
yeah, I was gonna say that sounded painful. That didn't sound good in the slightest.
How much you thinking? Like how much would this set me back? Because
Well,
you know what? Like
yeah.
don't be like a Grinch. Like I'm not that rich.
Oh, really? Oh, really? Oh, that's hilarious coming from the most wealthy man on the server.
Hermit challenges time. Hello! That's the first little one out of the way. There are so many of these things. There are so many Hermit challenges chickens. I mean, what, that's around about 6, maybe 7. There's probably another 10 over there. This is ridiculous.
Look at that. 1, 2, 3, 4 stacks of diamond blocks plus 24. Look at all those. Dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibby dibby dibby. Good luck remixing that one. Dibbity dibbity dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibbity dibbity. Dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibby 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 dibby. We are rolling it. Diamonds, 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 diamonds. Oh my goodness. Dibby 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 dibby. Diamonds, dibby dibby diamonds, 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 dibby dibby diamonds. Look at the diamonds we got. Dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibbity dibbity. Dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibby 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 diamonds. 55 diamond blocks. If we add this to our ever-increasing pile of diamonds, we are almost as rich as the town hall. Diamonds, 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 falling in diamonds. Dibby 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 dibby. Diamonds, dibby dibby diamonds, 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 dibby dibby diamonds. Dibby 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 diamonds, diamonds. Dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibbity dibbity. Okay, dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibby dibby diamonds, diamonds. Dibby 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 diamonds.
I would like to try and build 5 farms in this episode. In case you didn't hear me, that's 5. I don't want to say it too loudly because I don't want it to be true.
This was 100 diamonds? Oh my goodness. Oh baby, I'm freaking out. This is the best day of my life. Other than the day that my kids were born. That was a great day as well. I suppose marrying my wife was a very good thing as well. That was another great day.
Don't mind me. I've just got a couple of withers to take care of. Now, I found the one behind me, but there's a wither on the loose, and I have no idea where it is.
What do I do with the TNT, by the way?
I don't think there's anything to do with it, honestly.
Oh. No. XP? Not kind. Not kind at all.